In 2006, as president of the National Association of Evangelicals, Ted Haggard preached about the sinfulness of homosexuality and keeping secrets.
For years, Ted Haggard appeared to have everything: a powerful church, thousands of followers, and political connections that placed him surprisingly close to the White House. From the outside, his life looked like the perfect story of faith, influence, and success. But in 2006, one phone call exposed a secret that sent shockwaves through American evangelicalism and brought one of the country's most influential pastors crashing down almost overnight. What happened next was even more unexpected. He returned to preaching and attempted to reclaim the life he had lost. How Ted Haggard built his religious empire. Ted Arthur Haggard was born on June 27, 1956, in Indiana, and by the mid-1980s had settled in Colorado Springs with an ambition considerably larger than the modest home he was living in at the time. In 1984, he reportedly started New Life Church in the basement of that same house, gathering a small handful of worshipers around an idea that would eventually grow far beyond anything a basement could hold. Growth came fast and never really stopped for over 2 decades. As more people joined, Haggard's influence expanded beyond his local congregation, transforming New Life Church into one of Colorado's most prominent evangelical ministries and giving him a growing national profile. What began as roughly 20 people meeting informally eventually became a congregation of around 14,000 worshipers, reportedly built almost entirely through new conversions rather than members simply switching churches, eventually filling a sprawling $60 million campus on the edge of the city. Haggard also reportedly built the World Prayer Center alongside the church, a coordinating hub for one of the largest prayer networks in the world at the time, cementing his reputation as a builder of institutions rather than simply a gifted speaker. By 2003, Haggard's influence reached well beyond a single congregation in Colorado. He was elected president of the National Association of Evangelicals, an umbrella organization reportedly representing more than 30 million believers across tens of thousands of churches nationwide, a role that put him in regular contact with major political figures, including reported participation in weekly conference calls with officials inside the White House during the Bush administration. That same platform made Haggard one of the most recognizable evangelical voices in the country, a frequent media presence, and notably, one of the featured pastors inside the widely discussed 2006 documentary Jesus Camp, where he delivered a sermon publicly condemning homosexuality to his own congregation. Few pastors in America carried that same combination of institutional power and media visibility at the time, which made what happened only months later land with even greater force once it finally broke. Beyond the National Association of Evangelicals, Haggard had also reportedly founded the Association of Life-Giving Churches, a separate network of congregations that would later merge into an even larger coalition, further extending his influence well past his own home church in Colorado. Colleagues and journalists covering evangelical politics during that period frequently described him as one of a small handful of pastors capable of speaking for the entire movement on national television, a reputation built specifically on the idea that his own private life stood as a model for the values he preached publicly. The scandal that destroyed his empire. In November of 2006, a Denver massage therapist and self-described adult companion named Mike Jones came forward publicly, alleging that Haggard had paid him for intimate encounters over a period of roughly 3 years and had also purchased and used an illegal substance in his presence. Jones reportedly went to local radio and television stations directly with his account, and the story spread nationally within days. Haggard's own response shifted quickly under pressure. He initially told reporters outside his own house that he had purchased an illegal substance and received a massage from Jones, but denied having an intimate encounter with him, insisting he had been tempted by the substance but never actually used it. New Life Church's own leadership, however, reportedly told a local television station that Haggard had already admitted to at least some of Jones's claims privately before those public denials were even issued. Within days, Haggard stepped down from every leadership position he held, resigning as president of the National Association of Evangelicals and voluntarily stepping aside from New Life Church while an independent investigation proceeded. On November 2nd, 2006, a letter from Haggard was read aloud from the very same pulpit he had preached from for over 2 decades, describing himself as a deceiver and a liar who had given in to what he called his dark side, and confessing broadly to what he termed sexual immorality without spelling out every specific detail. An oversight board made up of clergy from other churches reportedly investigated the claims further and used considerably stronger language than Haggard's own careful public statements had. Their findings reportedly confirmed that the situation was more serious than his initial admission suggested, leaving church leaders facing difficult decisions about his future, his ministry, and the congregation that had trusted him for years. In 2007, he reportedly signed a $200,000 severance agreement with New Life that required him to leave Colorado Springs, cut off all contact with church members, and undergo an extended period of counseling, a restoration process that would later become the subject of an HBO documentary and an appearance on Oprah, turning Haggard's private unraveling into one of the most closely watched public falls in modern evangelical history. The second secret no one saw coming. The Mike Jones allegations were not, it turned out, the only claims connected to Haggard's downfall. Within months, New Life's leadership disclosed that a young male volunteer from the church, in his early 20s at the time, had also come forward describing an extended sexual relationship with Haggard. One church leadership reportedly described as consensual based on what they called an overwhelming pool of evidence. Years later, in 2009, that same young man, Grant Haas, identified himself publicly and offered a noticeably different account, describing what he called non-consensual sexual contact, rather than the consensual relationship church officials had characterized privately. Haggard, appearing on television around that same period, described the incident as an indicator of what he called compulsive behavior that had ruled him during that stretch of his life, without directly disputing that some version of the encounter Haas described had actually occurred. Gail Haggard, married to Ted since 1978, made the decision to stay married through all of it, later writing a memoir titled Why I Stayed that walked through her own reasoning in detail. In that same book, Gail reportedly described her husband as having experienced an inappropriate encounter during childhood, when he was around 7 years old. She connected that experience to struggles with same-sex attraction that she said continued into his college years. She also discussed an earlier relationship involving an adult store in Louisiana, describing these experiences as part of the complicated personal history she believed had influenced Haggard long before his ministry and later public scandal. That account, offered by his own wife rather than by Haggard himself in most retellings, remains her own explanation for a pattern that would, unfortunately, prove itself considerably harder to resolve than either of them likely hoped at the time the book was written. Gail's decision to remain married drew its own share of public scrutiny at the time, with some observers questioning why she stayed, and others pointing to her book as a genuinely candid account of faith, loyalty, and forgiveness under extraordinary public pressure. She reportedly stood beside her husband at multiple public appearances during his restoration period, including press conferences announcing his eventual return to ministry, a visible partnership that supporters have often pointed to as evidence of a marriage that survived something most relationships never could, and that critics have pointed to somewhat differently as a pattern of standing by him that arguably enabled the very cycle now stretching across 3 separate congregations. The Second Life of Ted Haggard. After roughly 4 years away from ministry entirely, Haggard and Gail returned to Colorado Springs. For a man whose previous ministry had collapsed so publicly, The decision to return to the same city where his reputation had been destroyed was significant. Instead of disappearing permanently from public ministry, the couple began the difficult process of rebuilding their lives and finding a way back into church leadership. In 2010, they founded a new congregation called St. James Church. The beginning was considerably more modest than the world Haggard had once occupied. Rather than returning immediately to a massive church building or a prominent pulpit, services reportedly began inside an old barn on a rural property. The setting was a dramatic contrast to the large-scale ministry Haggard had previously led. Eventually, the congregation purchased a proper building for weekly worship, giving the new church a more permanent home. The comeback did not remain a small local story for long. In 2012, Haggard and Gale appeared on the reality television series Celebrity Wife Swap, bringing their rebuilt family life into the homes of a much wider audience. The appearance became part of a broader effort to rehabilitate Haggard's public image following the original scandal. For a stretch of years, that rehabilitation appeared to be working. The man who had once been forced out of his ministry was again speaking publicly, leading a congregation, and presenting himself as someone who had survived an extraordinary personal collapse. Haggard reportedly leaned into that collapse as part of his message. Rather than simply attempting to distance himself from his past, he told audiences that his personal failures had given him an understanding of sin and grace that other pastors simply did not possess. The very chapter that had destroyed his reputation was gradually transformed into the emotional center of his comeback narrative. St. James Church itself was reportedly affiliated with the Free Methodist Church, representing a notable shift from the Southern Baptist ordination Haggard had originally held. The change reflected the different institutional environment surrounding his second ministry and became part of a broader picture of reinvention. Then, in 2016, Haggard reportedly helped found the network of redemptive churches. The coalition was specifically built around pastors who had experienced their own public falls and subsequent restoration. In that sense, Haggard's personal journey had evolved into an organizing philosophy. His own experience was no longer simply a story about one pastor trying to return to ministry. It became a framework through which other disgraced ministers could potentially find their own way back into leadership. But behind that same comeback narrative, according to later reporting, an old pattern was reportedly already resurfacing. In 2012, while counseling a young church member who was working through a serious substance dependency, Haggard allegedly asked that same young man to purchase an illegal substance on his behalf. The allegation was particularly troubling because of the setting in which it reportedly occurred, a church environment where Haggard had positioned himself as someone helping others confront destructive behavior. When confronted directly by a St. James elder, Haggard reportedly acknowledged the purchase and turned over a briefcase that was said to contain an illegal substance, a well-used pipe, and sexually explicit material. According to later reporting, the incident was handled quietly within the church, rather than disclosed publicly at the time it occurred. And that decision would matter. The allegations came back. By 2019, according to later reporting, 2 young adult men connected to St. James Church had reportedly told a fellow pastor at the church that Haggard had touched them inappropriately on multiple separate occasions. Allegations reportedly captured on videotape and shared with church leadership at the time. Membership at St. James reportedly declined noticeably in the years that followed as word of these newer allegations spread quietly through the congregation, with several former members later saying they left specifically because of growing concerns about Haggard's continued leadership. Haggard, for his part, reportedly declined to directly address the specific allegations when first approached by reporters, even as attendance and public confidence in the church continued eroding around him. Several former St. James members, including a pastor who had worked closely alongside Haggard at the church, reportedly went further still, describing what they characterized as first-hand knowledge of ongoing substance use and inappropriate conduct, rather than simply repeating rumors secondhand. That same pastor publicly called for Haggard to step down from leadership entirely, a request Haggard reportedly never seriously entertained, continuing instead to lead services, including at least one sermon reportedly delivered while four-wheeling alongside a group of youths from the church, even as the allegations against him continued circulating within the same congregation. In 2022, facing renewed public allegations and a shrinking congregation, Haggard sold the building St. James Church had been using and relocated services directly into his own home, rebranding the congregation once again under a new name, Story House Church, built around what he reportedly described as a micro-church or home church model. According to reporting at the time, somewhere between 40 and 60 people continued attending these home-based services, and Haggard reportedly spoke during an Easter sermon about renovating his own basement, specifically to create space for youth ministry, complete with a pool table, so that children could gather there during church activities. One church elder, speaking anonymously to a local reporter out of concern about going public, described Haggard in that same period as extraordinarily persuasive and manipulative, someone capable of making excuses that kept drawing people back in despite everything already known about him. Rather than directly address the newest allegations, Haggard reportedly used his own sermons that year to revise the story surrounding his original 2006 downfall, claiming in an August sermon that he had repented immediately at the time, a notably different account than the one his own church had described back in 2006, when he was reported to have denied Jones's claims entirely, right up until the pressure around him became impossible to withstand any further. He publicly rejected the newest allegations outright, telling his congregation he would never let what he called demonically inspired rumors determine how he lived his life, and insisting he had no plans to step away from ministry regardless of what continued to surface around him. That same revisionist framing extended even further in later sermons, with Haggard reportedly telling his small home congregation that the original 2006 accusations had come from someone who, in his own words, did not really know him very well, effectively recasting the man who had once confessed to being a deceiver and a liar from his own pulpit as someone who had instead been misunderstood by an outsider. Longtime observers of the story have noted the contradiction directly, since Haggard cannot simultaneously have repented immediately at the time while also having spent his first several days publicly denying the very claims he now says he immediately accepted as true. What Ted Haggard left behind. What makes Ted Haggard's story so difficult to file away cleanly is exactly this pattern: scandal, partial admission, quiet comeback, renewed allegations, and then, each time, a slightly smaller room to retreat into. A 14,000-seat campus shrinking down to a barn, the barn eventually shrinking down to his own basement. Supporters who have stayed with him across all three chapters point to his own account of repentance and to a genuine belief in second chances as reason enough to keep listening. Former members and church elders who eventually walked away point instead to a documented, repeating pattern spanning 16 years and 3 separate congregations, arguing that repentance, which keeps needing to happen again, is not quite the same thing as change. The particular irony sitting underneath the entire story has never fully faded either. A preacher whose national reputation was partly built on forceful public opposition to homosexuality, ultimately undone more than once by his own private conduct along remarkably similar lines. Whether that irony reflects a man genuinely at war with something inside himself, as his wife's own book suggests, or something considerably more calculated repeating itself behind increasingly private doors, remains a question his own former congregations are still visibly divided over today. Ted Haggard is reportedly still preaching, still leading a small, home-based congregation in Colorado Springs, still insisting the loudest critics have simply never taken the time to understand him. The sanctuary has gotten smaller with each chapter of this story, but the pattern inside it, by nearly every available account, has not. Religion writers who have followed Haggard across all 3 chapters of this story have pointed to something beyond simple personal failing as well, a broader question about how independent, self-governing congregations handle allegations against a single, highly persuasive founding leader with no larger denominational body directly overseeing him. Unlike a bishop-led church structure, where a central authority could in theory remove a pastor facing repeated allegations, Haggard's smaller, self-founded congregations have generally left decisions about his continued leadership entirely in his own hands, a structural gap several former members have pointed to directly when explaining why they eventually felt they had no real path forward except to simply leave. That same structural gap helps explain something that might otherwise seem hard to believe. A pastor facing 3 separate rounds of serious allegations across 16 years, each time simply founding a new, smaller congregation rather than facing any outside body capable of formally removing him. Whether that reflects a genuine gap in religious accountability more broadly, or something specific to how Haggard himself has structured every congregation he has ever led, remains part of the same unresolved debate surrounding nearly everything else connected to his name. From a 14,000-member megachurch to sermons delivered from his own basement, Ted Haggard's story became more than a single scandal. It became a story of power, controversy, reinvention, and questions that never completely disappeared. But after everything we've uncovered, one question remains. Was this truly a story of redemption, or simply a cycle repeating itself? Tell us what you think in the comments, and subscribe for more stories History Never Fully Explains.